All right, so let's go in. I'm going to talk about uncertainty. And very often we'll use the terms, uncertainty and error kind of interchangeably. And really what we mean is that, that fuzziness in the estimated last digit when we make measurements. So that's a nice concrete thing to think about and associate with these kind of concepts. Okay. And so what we have are two terms that are very similar. We talk about accuracy. And so accuracy indicates how close our measured value is to an accepted value. Okay. And we can also have a term called precision, and that indicates how close measured values are to one another. So if you make repeated measurements of the same thing, how close are they? How far apart do they spread? Are they real, tight or not? And so very often what they'll do is they'll use this bullseye analogy to illustrate the relationship between accuracy and precision. And so what we get is that in this case, there's a big spread to the data points, but in this case, they're, much more compact. So these repeated measurements are really close to one another. These ones are further apart. So high precision, low precision. And then when we take repeated measurements like this, then we will report that our result is essentially the average. And so that's going to be like the middle of the spread type of idea in this bullseye analogy. So if the center of the spread is at the center of the target, then we have good accuracy. And how big the spread is indicates the precision. And so here we have a wide spread, but then the center of the spread is at the center of the target, so that's accurate, but not precise. Here we have a tight grouping, so we have high precision, and the center of the spread's at the center of the target, so that is, has good accuracy. So this is accurate and precise. This is neither accurate nor is it precise. So that's the deal. Now we can also go in and talk about how to, how much accuracy or how much precision we have. And we use these terms, the percent error. So we have is a measured value and an accepted value, and we're going to compare the two. Now in this, what we'll do is we'll take the absolute value of the difference between the two, divided by the accepted, and of course times 100 to make it a percentage. Now I always was taught that it's absolute values. Not everybody does the absolute values. Some people would argue that without the absolute values, you can have positive and negative percent errors. And so you can see if your measured quantity was greater than the accepted or less than the accepted, and that's, useful information. But I was taught it's absolute values. So again, this is more of a convention, a choice that I made for how we are going to do things. But again, we have measured and accepted, measured and accepted. So percent error has to do with accuracy. Versus if we talk about the percent difference where we have two measured values, M1 and M2, and we're going to see how close they are to one another. So this is a precision idea, okay? In this case, it is always the absolute value of the difference. And then you don't divide by one or divide by the other, treating it as if it's the accepted. What you do is you divide by the average. So it's the difference over the average, and again, times 100 to make it a percentage. Okay. So there we go. Now, when we see our error or our uncertainty, very often we can categorize it as whether it is random error or systematic error. So a random error is what they say always present in the measurements due to unpredictable fluctuations in the measurement process. For example, if we were to take this little tennis ball and I'm going to drop it, okay, and let's say that I'm going to give every one of y'all is going to get a little stopwatch, okay, and so then when I drop the ball and you run the stopwatches, are all the stopwatches going to read the same when we're done? No, there ain't no way, right? Because your ability to start the stopwatch when I exactly drop the ball and stop the stopwatch when it hits my hand is going to be limited, right? Some of you will, start it too soon. Some will be just a little too late, on both ends. And so then you're going to get this variety, this wide variety of times that you're going to measure with the stopwatches. This is a good example of random error. Okay, so that the random error, what happens is that, we almost always describe that in terms of statistical analysis. These are, again, repeated measurements of the same thing. And so having variations in that is, again, an issue with precision. And if we come into systematic error, a lot of times the science areas will refer to this as bias. So you probably have heard that term instead of systematic error, but either way. And so, for example, if the stopwatches that I gave you ran slow, then the amount of times you would mark would be too short, too little. And so therefore, while we would still have that random signature in all of the times, they would all be too short, systematically low. Okay. Now, technically, if we work at it, we could identify how slow each stopwatch ran and then take the readings and correct them for the slowness of the stopwatches and get a better time. But we're never going to do any experiment to the point where we can identify and remove any of the systematic errors. So, that is just that. But what's kind of nice for us to be able to identify is that if all of your values were too low or all the values are too high, then that's a pretty strong indication we have a systematic error present in the experiment. And so it'd be nice if we could identify that. Oh, there's some sort of systematic error going on. I think that's kind of what we're kind of going for, is to, have you be able to recognize it's like, oh, look, everything's too short or too small. Everything's too big, either way. It indicates we have a systematic error. And if you just have some things are too big, some things are too small, then that's pretty much standard random error. And random error is always there. So now, one thing I will do in the labs is I will have you give 3 what I would call major sources of error. Okay. Very often that's what I will ask for. And so to help you identify 3 major sources, we're going to talk about kind of some general groupings of how to think about things. So the first source of error might be the measuring device that we used, right? So when we talk about using the ruler to measure the little pad of paper here, then we talk about that the general rule is that you would be plus or minus half the finest division. And since the finest divisions are millimeters, we'd be plus or minus half a millimeter. Seems all well, fine and good. And so that's actually one of the things, because if we had a ruler, instead of being marked in millimeters, it was only marked in centimeters. So 0 and 1, and then 2, and then 3, and none of these little marks were in there. Then when we would come in and try to measure the pad of paper, then if we only had, 7's there and 8's down here, then it's between 7 and 8, we get 7 point something centimeters. You have a much larger fluctuation in the measurements if you go out with 7.6 versus 7.5 versus 7.7 or whatever kind of things. And so then the fluctuation's pretty big compared to fluctuating in between the tick marks on the millimeters. Okay. So that has to do with what they call the precision or the fineness on the measuring device. So it could be like limitations on the measuring device are what are limiting our ability to get good results. Usually that's not really a big issue for us, but it's technically a thing. And not only could it be a precision issue, it could also be an accuracy issue. You could sit there and go, well, are the millimeters really millimeters? How good was the calibration on this measuring device? And then you could argue, well, maybe it was actually calibrated when it was at, normal temperatures. And now that it's, absolutely freezing out, the ruler has thermally contracted and now my millimeters aren't millimeters anymore. But let me tell you this, while that is a possible source of error, that will never be a major source of error in any of our labs. And if you write thermal expansion of the ruler is the reason we got bad results, then I'm not going to believe you as being a major source of error. While it may be a source, it won't be a major one. Okay. The next kind of topic we can think about is the measurement process itself. Maybe that's where all the issue was in. I mean, so if we go in and I say, oh, well, I'm going to take this ruler here and we're going to measure the width of the room. Well, that implies you're going to put the ruler down. We're going to pick the ruler up, put the ruler down, pick the ruler up, put the ruler down multiple times. And then you have to sit there and go, well, do you think you put it down exactly where you picked it up? Are we sure we didn't zigzag our way down the room? I mean, so the reading we get off of that is definitely not going to be good to plus or minus half a millimeter, And you're like, well, how will we figure that out? Well, I mean, by having made the measurement, you can kind of go, well, I think we're going to be good to the centimeter or so, or, you could put in a hypothesis on kind of where you think the uncertainty will be. But almost always, the answer is in science that we should make repeated measurements and run statistics and allow it to tell us what the uncertainty was. Okay. So either we're going to use kind of a standard rule or we're going to go in and we're going to do statistics. But I mean, technically, you could kind of go in and posit, I think it's really like this amount and then try to, support that or defend that. So, all right. And then we could also talk about the object or the model that we use for the analysis. So, when we talk about the width of the pad of paper, you might ask, what do you mean by the width? Because as you move along the length, it's possible that the width could fluctuate, especially if we have something more like this, which is a little bit more rough, then definitely the width reading would fluctuate as you move across. You might go, well, what happens when you have like a pock mark here? How do we measure that? Where are we at? What does it mean to make that particular measurement? Okay, so it could be something like that. It could also have to do with the model that we use. Because remember, in general, what we are doing is we have made some sort of, prediction. And then we're going to try to test that by making the actual measurement so that we can compare the two, But what you'll find is that if we go back to the dropping the ball kind of thing, then predominantly we'll make assumptions like, oh, there's no air resistance on the ball when it falls to be able to do the calculation to get our predicted time. And so, but when we made the measured time, there was air. So there was air resistance, some, probably not a lot, but some. And so therefore, we should technically be systematically off because the predicted value assumed there wasn't any air resistance, but the calculated quantity, there was air present. So it could be the model, it could be the object, it could be how you're actually making the measurement process. I mean, if you think back to the first lab we're working on, it was kind of a funny way to measure the circumference on those cylinders, right? That's definitely going to be an issue, and that's a measurement process kind of idea. Okay. And so when I want three major sources, I don't need one of each, category. These are just here to kind of help us think about what kind of errors could there be and where would they come up from. And then you can sit back and go, I have a whole bunch, which were my major ones. And it could end up that you had, three all out of one category and none out of the other two, or, it doesn't have to just be one out of each. Okay. So don't think that that's how it has to be. Okay. So yeah, three major sources. Let's talk about things that are inappropriate sources of error. Okay, and the first one is just the phrase human error. And the reason that this one is not okay is because that doesn't really say anything. You go, oh, there was human error in the experiment. Yeah, and how, why? If we go back to the dropping the ball type of idea, I mean, the major source of error is going to be in reaction time of your ability to start the stopwatch and stop the stopwatch. So you are the major source of error, but you just don't want to say, well, it's human error. No, you want to say, well, there was difficulty in starting and stopping the stopwatch at exactly the right points, in the experiment, And so describing how and why you are the source of error is perfectly fine. Saying something just generic like, well, there was human error is like, well, there were mistakes. I'm like, open labs on Friday, come in and repeat it, until you get it right, This next one we're not really going to need to worry about because it's procedural error. If for some reason you did the experiment wrong, then really what you collected was not data, but you just have garbage. I mean, there's no use of things that were done wrong. And there's no sense in trying to analyze things that were done wrong. But in the videos, which are predominantly what we're going to use, it's not going to be done wrong. So we won't need to worry about that one. But you should recognize that that's not a good source of error. The other thing are computational errors. And we just talked about having round-off error. And there's the possibility of miscalculations. Oh, I didn't calculate it right. Well, those aren't good reasons for why your value is off, because these are fixable and you should fix them. Okay? It is assumed that you will have done the experiment correctly, you will have handled the digits and done the calculations correctly, and that all of those things are correct. And so really what we're looking for is inherently, why did we not get a better value on our experiment? What was preventing us from getting the absolute best result? What are these sources of error here? Okay. So there we go. And so now that we have that in place, we can talk about some rules for reporting uncertainties. So these next two things are very important. And we're going to need to you're going to need these later on. So just remember that they're here on this sheet. This was located under lab 1 for the measurement error. I also put it under the handouts. So this is where we're going to report the uncertainties. And so there are 3 rules. Then they go in order. So the first rule is that the uncertainty should only have 1 significant digit. So this is why I talk about digits. So we can then look at an uncertainty and determine, how to round it to 1 significant digit, okay, to the first digit. And then wherever that digit hits, then the value should be rounded to the same place as that 1 digit, okay. And then the third rule is that our values in the uncertainties should have the same power of 10 and, of course, the same units. So we can tell if things match up, okay? And so we saw that when we measured the little pad of paper. We talked about how the width was 7.63 centimeters, and we said that the 3 was our estimated digit. And with our standard rule, we said it was half the finest division. So that would be, 0.5 millimeters or 0.05 centimeters, okay? Now notice that when we write it this way, it abides by the rule. And this is why we have this, is because our estimated digit was the 3, and we were uncertain in that value by 5 units, is what we're claiming. So there should only be 1 significant digit here, which is the 5. Remember, leading zeros don't count. It's in the second decimal place, and so this is reported to the second decimal place. Notice that if you don't abide by the second rule, it doesn't make any sense, right? You shouldn't be able to go with 7.632154 plus or minus 0.05. So you're telling me that we are uncertain by 5 units in the 3. So the 3 has 5 units of certainty. Where did all these other numbers come from? And the answer is, well, they shouldn't, because those are not, those are no good, okay? So if you're uncertain in the 3 by 5 units, then that's as far out as we can go. You shouldn't be able to get more, nor should you be able to do, I guess I was doing the other numbers in green. I'll try to keep with my pattern. So this is no good. And or should we be able to do 7.6 plus or minus 0.05 centimeters, right? So if you can, in the second decimal place, you're uncertain by 5 units, but then you didn't write down a second decimal place. What'd you do? Just get lazy and not make the estimate? I mean, you're claiming you can go that far out, but you didn't. So that doesn't make any sense. So these don't matter because they don't match, you know, same place. They should match places. There should only be one digit in the uncertainty because we're talking about how uncertain is that one estimated digit. That's kind of our interpretation on that. And so that's where we're going to stick with that. Now, I know in other science areas, they might have more than one digit on uncertainties, but for us, we're only going to do one. Again, these are the conventions for my course and for my lab. And these are the ones we're going to stick with. Okay, so other areas and other instructors might have slightly different rules, but these are the ones we are going to do. Okay. And then down here, I talked about what you need for a complete graph. We need an appropriate descriptive title, labels and units on each axis. This third one I don't think we need anymore because the current program of the Logger Pro doesn't do the automatic connect the dots, connect the data points. So we don't need to undo that. So this, I guess I should remove this one at some point in time. But we do need a best fit line with uncertainty in the slope and intercept. Okay. And this last one is the reason why Excel doesn't work very well. You know, it's not super easy to get that using Excel. You can get it, but it's just not easy to do. And making graphs in Excel is not easy to begin with. So that's just the deal. So we're going to use a program that's basically the interface between the sensors and the computer in the lab. And so we can get nice things like the data run, and then we can analyze it ourselves. So yeah, and when we use it to make graphs, it's usually pretty straightforward. Usually by the second or third graph, we're getting the hang of it, and nobody needs help or has any questions, and it all looks great. If we were going to do Excel, it'd probably be about spring break by the time it was good, and nobody would need help because it's just that clunky for making things like that.